You liked it, didn't you? It's good, isn't it? Thanks for showing up, especially so late. I mean, it's very, very much past my bedtime.
But it is a Saturday night. So.
It is a Saturday night.
Well, thank you guys for coming. We're just going to have a little discussion, a little chat about music in movies. And I'm a re-recording mixer, which means my job is to put sound in the movie, in the room, on the screen. It includes dialogue and music and sound effects. Richard is a sound designer, mixer extraordinaire. He worked on a little movie called Apocalypse Now. And I was very fortunate when I was starting to be his assistant, so I learned a lot from him. And then Laura was a composer on a film I mixed last year called The Marvels. And Richard and Laura worked together on the next film they're going to show here tonight, which is called Paris Can Wait. That was done about
2011?
2000, yeah.
2016.
16, yeah.
So, first thing I wanted to talk to you about was dialogue in the movie, because, you know, I'm a mixer, and it's always kind of a struggle when we get the sound and the music together to put everything together so that you can hear the dialogue, you can hear the music, and a lot of times it has to do with what's in the score and how the score is written. So when you're writing for a movie that has a lot of dialogue, this is a good example of that. How do you approach it? What do you think about to help you compose or orchestrate your process?
Well, first of all, you wish the dialogue would go away. That's the very what you do. You have this vision of just music and sound. Pray for that, really. No, well, no. It's a complicated process, and it's different for every single movie. I tend to write themes at the piano because and it's the same thing with The Marvels and Paris Can Wait. I think you want to write a theme that can carry a movie. So you've got to have something that even if you don't use it in its totality, you have to have it so that it's material you can draw upon. And a film like this, and it's the same exact thing with the film that many of you will see coming up, Paris Can Wait. They're jazzy scores. And you want to have the sense of jazz, right? But in these scores, it's particularly difficult because if somebody's blowing a solo and you're in the middle of a line of dialogue, well, the director's not going to like that very much. So, I mean, this is getting in the weeds, but what I did for both films, actually, is that I recorded all the elements separately, so that basically you can bring down the various elements like saxophones and flutes that might get in the way of dialogue, mix them down, and even shift them around. So in this movie in particular, there's a scene when they're walking, it's one of the first love scenes between Monk and Coraline, where they're walking down to the beach, and Monk will say something, and then there'll be a pause, and you'll hear a little sax, and then Coraline will say something. And it works nicely, especially in a jazz score, because it feels the voices are actually working with the musical instruments to really create a vibrancy and a sense that everything is music, whether it's somebody speaking or an instrument playing.
So when you're writing that piece, you're writing it with the dialogue playing.
I'll write it and then I'll check it back with dialogue, generally, much to the consternation of music editors. But in this particular one, and also Paris Can Wait, I mean, they had another thing in common in that these were both first-time directors, right? Eleanor Coppola, who had done Heart of Darkness, a documentary, along with Apocalypse Now, at 79, directed her first film. And this is, of course, Jefferson's first film. So when you're doing a jazzy score and it's a first film, that means that you want to be recording all along, because you can't say, hey, the samples are really bad and don't worry, it'll sound good once it's recorded, because new directors don't have the experience of having gone through that.
Knowing that you're going to record it again and it's going to be
fine, and they lose confidence in themselves and in you. So it's really important to just go ahead and take those risks and record, and then have the flexibility to really be able to move stuff around and to fit it into dialogue. And I know Richard, when we worked together, did a lot of that with the score for your own stuff like that, moving my little notes.
Editorial liberties.
Oh,
Oh, I'm sorry, editorial liberties.
We call those creative decisions.
Oh, creative.
So I know that, you've worked with a lot of directors, and I'm sure you've come across a situation where the score has been written right across a dialogue scene, and when you're in the mix, you're like, what am I gonna do with this? Was there any event like that that you remember where somebody was like writing a piece of music all over the dialogue, and you had to kind of figure out what to do with it?
Are you speaking of the incident I was mentioning?
Oh, yeah,
earlier?
exactly.
Okay. Years ago, on a film called Gardens of Stone, Francis directed. His father was a composer, and we were doing a music spotting session, and there was a scene that came up, and there was a romantic scene with Angelica Houston and James Caan, I think. And Karpman, who was very enthusiastic, was getting excited, and he said, Francie, just wait till you hear the wonderful love theme I written for this scene. And Francis looked at him and said, Dad, this scene doesn't need a love theme. And what do you mean? And he started humming it for his dad. His dad said, that's lovely, Dad, but I had never even thought of music in this scene. And Carmine's answer to that was, damn dialogue, always getting in the way.
Exactly.
Laura introduced that idea as sort of a joke
Yeah.
earlier, but he meant it.
Yes, well, a lot of times when we're mixing, like you were talking about the different, different elements, and so when you record the score, you'll get what we call stems. So you put the percussion on one group of tracks, and the strings on another, and the solos on another, so that when we're mixing it, we can kind of do those dances around, keep the percussion going, but lower the solo instruments, or things that are going to fight in the dialogue area. When you're orchestrating, though, when you're recording the score, I always wonder, do you think about that in orchestration, or do you try to do different orchestrations and see which one is gonna work best for the picture? How do you decide when and how to orchestrate?
I mean, I think it depends on the project. I think with the Marvels, with a big movie like that, yes, you've got 100 people playing, so you have to mitigate, how loud the music is when you record it, because of course, it's not just a matter of like turning down the volume, it's a matter of a completely different sound and timbre when people play softly. So yes, you do that, and of course, you don't want some loud French horn right in exactly the same register as the dialogue that's going on. You'll lose the whole score. So you absolutely think about that. It's one of the beautiful things about doing this, is it's a super collaborative art, and it comes with parameters, right? You have to, if you're a composer, you want your music to be heard, you've got to work it with what's going on screen, or else it's just gonna get dialed out or eliminated altogether. On American Fiction, the editor in particular, and oftentimes editors do this, was very, very particular about what would happen when. So that's why that idea of recording everybody, like really having a lot of separation in the recording, and that's tough to do with jazz, because part of the vibe is you want to have the feeling of ensemble. So it becomes like doing and redoing and going back, and a lot of editing, I think, just to make it feel like it was all recorded at once and mixed together. But that's the skill. That's really the skill of doing it. And as Laura was, or as Richard was saying rather, I think spotting it too, deciding where music should go and how it should come in, winds up being really essential, I think, to an audience accepting music and accepting what you're gonna do to support the characters in those moments.
So oftentimes when people are cutting the film, or every time, they'll have what's called a temp score. They'll take music from other movies and put it in, what's your feeling about temp music, and is it the bane of your existence? Is it something that's helpful? I mean, a lot of people are very unhappy by
Resentful of temp tracks.
yeah.
I don't find that, actually. Yeah, I think it's another tool in the toolbox in editing and filmmaking. In American fiction, it was all temped with classic jazz, right? Which like felt really like that. You hear the last thing is Miles Davis doing da 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 da, and it feels great, right? But that's over a big pullback scene. There's no dialogue, and there's when you have a set piece of music, especially a piece of jazz, you can't let it play underneath the dialogue. It won't work. So that ergo is the way that you start, designing the score. And Paris Can Wait, I can't remember what the temp was. Was it jazz? Do you remember what we temped with?
I have no.
No, nobody knows. But a lot of,
Maybe you tempted.
yeah, I feel like I wrote it.
You did sketches like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think I may have actually created the temp music for that one. But a lot of the times, it's a very, very useful tool in helping everybody kind of get on the same page. Like, is this working for you? Is this not working for you? Where does it work? Where does it stop working? And a crafted score is always gonna be better than a temp score. But I think what you're alluding to is that sometimes filmmakers become absolutely, completely addicted to their temp scores. And so you gotta shake them loose by doing better. And so that becomes, a glorious challenge.
Sort of a temp love situation.
Yeah. So Richard, is the sound designer and creates the sound effects. He is sort of the original idea of the sound designer wasn't, somebody nowadays, a sound designer would be associated with somebody who sits in a room and creates crazy sound effects and monster voices and, special events. But Richard's version of sound design, which I think is the right one, is he's in charge of the entire soundtrack. So the music, the sound effects, the dialogue, the whole package of it. Is that a good description of how you just?
I think so. I mean, it sounds a little grandiose. It's a lot of nuts and bolts sort of work. And how many people know what a production designer is on a film? Okay, people have a fair understanding of production design. Well, a sound designer is sort of function in a similar capacity to an art director or a production designer. Only he or she does it for the soundtrack. And so it's that integrating those three fundamental elements to best advantage.
And at what point, when you're working on the sound design, do you start listening to the music? As you're creating sound effects, or as you're building a scene, the sonic part of the scene, when would you bring the music in for your own?
Well, usually in films I've worked on, the director has an idea about the music before they even start shooting. And as soon as it's edited, those things start being introduced into the picture cutting room. And so these things are sort of floating around in the score and being thought about what they would like, unless they're working with a composer who is working on a picture from the get-go, and the composer is creating sketches of things that'll be fleshed out and developed as the picture develops. But from the very first stage, I start listening to what is in mind, and on pictures where I don't know the composer, I try to make a point of being introduced or speaking to the composer. The director is usually aware that there's an important relationship that has to be made, and we sort of talk to each other about sort of what we're thinking about. And a lot of composers historically have really worried and not very sympathetic to the sound design. Would you agree with that, Laura?
Is that Laura Hirschberg?
In a way, there was a bit of sort of a rivalry or a competition between sound effects and music. and it's unconstructive in the end. And
I agree with that.
And also, Richard, you're one of the, it's very uncommon for someone to mix the sound effects and the music together as their single job. Very often, there's a sound effects mixer and a dialogue music mixer. So you always took those two things at the same, the same.
Yeah, I just didn't know how you could do one without the other, and do this integration thing. And that's Dimension of Apocalypse was a very early picture of mine, and that integration of the music into sound was an idea from the get-go. So I sort of came into the industry thinking that way. And it works for me, and hopefully it works for the composer as well.
Yeah, I mean, it works great for a composer. I think you have to understand that this is a collaborative art, and that it's ultimately not only gonna be better for the picture, but better for your music if you trust these incredible people who are here to help facilitate that. I think that where the rivalries happen, are on big movies, I think, where you're really having a competition between sound effects and music. But I think that comes from poorly designed spotting, right? So that if I can't compete with, like, if the world's blowing up, right? There's no way, like in the Marvels, basically at one point the universe blows up. It's way better that she does that than I do that, right? So a great movie to look at for this, one of my favorites is North by Northwest, because it's every decision sonically between sound and music and Foley and everything is so well thought out. And often there are only ever three things at once, and most of the time two things at once, and they flow really beautifully into each other. And for how many people are know that movie by heart, North by Northwest? A few. Okay, so the great scene is of course the field scene, right? The field scene is all done with gorgeous sound and Foley, and the music doesn't come in until the truck explodes, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and it comes in at exactly the right emotional time, right? And so I think that's what we all really look for as filmmakers, is we look for giving each other sonic space. Sometimes those spaces are simultaneous, and sometimes they're not. And as long as we're willing to do a trade, I think it works out great.
There's some composers who will write a suite and hand it to the director, not even do it to picture. Have you ever worked like that, or is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, no, that is, for Marvel projects, that is the Marvel way.
Yeah.
You do a suite, and for American Fiction, I did much of the same thing. I didn't write a suite, but I wrote, the scene when he's standing outside looking at the ocean. I did 3 versions of that scene when they first came to the studio. I did a version of it with Ruby My Dear, the Monk theme, because I thought it might be possible to actually use the music of Monk, but I wasn't sure if I could do it. I did a version of it with the with Monk's my original, the diode, and then I did a 3rd version, which I actually cannot remember what that was, and gave them those choices. So and then I adapted the Monk theme to a different scene, and so the filmmakers had proof of concept, which is I think what you're looking for in either that initial meeting when you're playing them, a bunch of music, and certainly with Marvel projects, you do the theme suite, for the director and for the studio executives. Again, can this theme go through the paces, the emotional paces that a movie needs? So yeah, I think so. And I think with Paris Can Wait, I did a couple of 2 or 3 versions of that opening. I did a version of the opening, which then we rejected and used elsewhere, and then I wrote another cue. So this is what happens all the time. Some things fly and sometimes they don't.
And things move around a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
The cue that was conceived for a scene in Reel 1 really ends up working much better for some reason, in Reel 4 towards the end.
That's so true. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of times when I'm mixing too, when I show up, music just appears to me. I haven't been living with it for a long time like you guys did. So my first instinct is trying things out, like playing it maybe louder, trying different, balances. Do you find that you do that too, and kind of find a reaction you get from it?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's like, we don't just put it in, we kind of like play it, and whichever feeling, triggers something is the good version of it.
And sometimes, usually the music, there's an idea of how it's going to play when it's conceived and put in, and you get to the dubbing stage, and a flick of the wrist and you've done something, and whoa, that sounds better.
Right.
You have to be prepared to give up preconceptions, I think.
I think so too, and I think a lot of people, when they get to the stage where everything's mixed together, it's different, because there'll be new sounds in there, the music might be recorded, it might sound really different, and it's that same thing with, like moving from the temp into actual scoring, there's a shock to it, I think, for people, and they have to sit around and get used to it, and spend 12 hours on their phone, and listen and listen and listen, and then eventually, they come home.
Yeah. It's an interesting alchemy, I always think, when you put music into a movie. Just this third thing that happens between the action on the screen and the music and the audience. It's kind of sort of a special thing that cinema can do with music, which is kind of unique. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, that like stories have always had music in them throughout time. People would tell stories and sing stories, but it seems weird, it seems kind of counterintuitive that this should work, and yet it does.
And it works strangely and inexplicably, and a good example of what scoring does is if you look at the endings of this film, right? There are 3 different endings, but it's essentially very similar footage, right? With 3 completely different styles of score. The first one is based on the My Pathology music, so it's his kind of, stag-arly, like monk coming together. The second one is romantic comedy, and the third one is 90s cop drama, like on purpose to say these 3 endings all sit in different film genres, and we can explain those genres through the subtext of score, which is just extraordinary, right? That score comes with a set of expectations that because you've heard music, that we immediately have, as composers, this kind of, completely unspoken communication with you as an audience. We know that oftentimes when you hear a French horn, you might feel that's heroic, or a saxophone that might feel sexy, or, like, is gonna be suspenseful, You know this, we know it, and then it's a matter of how we use it to either meet or destroy expectations.
It can also get abused a little bit, though.
Yes.
Too. Like oftentimes, you'll be watching a film and the music will sort of be there before you are.
Right.
Give you the, you won't let the audience experience it as the people on screen are experiencing it. Now, a lot of times when we're mixing, I'll just take a cue and move it
Slide
later.
it.
Yeah, I know, now it works because it's doing the right thing, but it's ahead of the audience. It has to kind of let the audience experience it first.
Give the audience more credit, in a way.
That North by Northwest scene is an interesting one of those, because if you think about it, if they were to make that film today,
It would come way earlier.
It would have music all across
Yeah.
it, and yet what works there is that the music is like, that's the emotional release of it, not the emotional while it's happening.
Yeah, and that film, it's really gorgeous for that, because in every cue, not just that one, they wait and wait and wait and wait until the right moment. And it's every person that you work with has a really different taste in terms of where they want the emotion. In this film, for example, in American Fiction, the whole beginning, my first take on it is, let's push it, make it all drums until he writes my pathology. And the producers in Cord really wanted to lean into comedic tropes so that the audience could know that it was okay to laugh in the beginning, So that literally we worked on that a lot. So we literally changed the emotional resonance of what the film was in it. It's the same thing in Paris Can Wait, where I started out with this much more kind of romantic version. They're sitting in the south of France and eating croissant and juice, and it's Cannes Film Festival, and I thought, oh my God, this is the most romantic thing ever. But Ellie and Richard wanted something that was funnier, that let you know that what you were gonna see was a comedy. So, my first take on it was not what the filmmakers wanted, and so you just have to know that that's absolutely cool, and that that you try again and get it right.
I remember I worked in a movie that Richard was the sound designer called Adaptation.
God,
And there was this scene in there, and I'll never forget this, where I don't remember what the scene was, but it's Meryl Streep doing something. It's a nighttime scene, it's very tender, and there's music in it, and I was mixing the music in the sound effects, and he kept saying like, lower, 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 the music. And I kept having to make it really, 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 really quiet, and I'm like, this is gonna be too quiet, no one's gonna hear this. He's like, no. And we got to this point where suddenly I could hear Meryl Streep's breathing, I could hear the actor in the scene, and it was like, oh, I get it. We have to be under her, we can't be on top of that action. So it's really interesting how just the performance and the breath in the performance, really kind of made you lean in enough so that now you're invested in that character's emotional state instead of the music giving you that.
It pushed the intimacy.
Right, but it's intimacy between you and the character, really.
Character, right.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Do you remember that movie? There's another scene in that movie that people always comment on. I can't remember what director it was, but somebody was saying like there was a car crash in the scene. He said, I want this car crash to be like Adaptation. I'm like, no. No one would remember that, but it was a really cool scene and that was an interesting scene too, because I don't remember much of the music in that film. It's pretty good. But that car crash scene was another instance where we were, it's kind of in 360 degrees, the sound went around us very quickly. It was very disorienting. And I remember thinking, like, if you use those moments effectively, then the disorientation that the sound gives you is very important. If you keep doing that through the whole movie, you're gonna lose that effect. And I think it's a similar thing happens with music when you start to, put the orchestra behind you in the rear surrounds and kind of unmix the orchestra so that the strings are over here and the brass over there. You kind of unmix everything. The audience gets disoriented by that pulling things apart. And with music, you kind of want to bring things together. Do you have a feeling about how things get mixed into the movie in the spatial part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, listen, I spent so many years in TV that when we mixed the Marvels, and I remember I sat on that stage with you, it was like, oh my God, I scored a big movie. It was like the best thing ever. So I'm always thrilled just to hear music mixed properly. I don't mess around too much with where things should go. I think that is really the domain of these two. It's my goal to deliver a score that has the right emotional resonance and that gives you the flexibility wherever possible to do the work you need to do, knowing that if I let them do their work, it's gonna work out better for me because you'll be able to hear more. If I restrict them too much and don't give them the kind of elements they need to be able to play, then the music's just gonna get turned down all the time,
Transparency is always a big deal with me. With inexperienced composers, they come to me and they're a little worried how it's gonna be received, what to do, and I'll say, transparency in a score is a really valuable thing. Sometimes a lot could be going on musically, and you can hear right through it to the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you think that's orchestration or?
I think it's writing style and orchestration stuff. It's hard because a lot of young early composers they fill it up too much.
I think that every movie has of music, of the weight of music in the movie. right?
That it can hold.
Yeah, how much can it hold? And some movies are very delicate and cannot hold much. American fiction actually can hold a surprising amount of music. And I think it doesn't in the beginning, but then as soon as Lisa dies and you start moving into the emotional things, and the family story becomes, you know, the anchor, the beautiful anchor of the film, you can build, you know, and it can take more. And then, you know, there's certain scenes, and I'm a maximalist. I mean, I love to just, excuse me, write the shit out of music. But in this film, there were like also scenes where it's just solo piano, and I was satisfied. You know, it was oddly enough. And in the movie, in the Marvels that we did together, I mean, you know, and those are massive, massive soundscapes. But you know, I wish in the Marvels, I guess I shouldn't say this, but I think I will. I wish we'd had more quiet moments. I wish we had had more moments where we could have really explored the emotion of what was going on. You know, I felt like there were scenes that I wish that I'd been able to score. You know, and I think it probably would have, you know, brought more emotional resonance to that particular film.
When did you decide you wanted to be a film scorer?
Well, I kind of fell into it, you know, I don't know, it's like, I used to think I didn't want to be a film composer, but now I look back and I think maybe I always did. But I grew up out here, and my father was a cardiologist, and he had a lot of like patients, you know, in and around Hollywood, and I just decided that I was gonna be an East Coast intellectual, whatever that meant. So I went to New York, and I went to Juilliard, and then I would go, you know, write music, and there were like 4 people in the audience, and nobody really liked it, and nobody really liked being there, everybody was miserable, and I think I was. And then this particular, my professor at Juilliard recommended me to go to the Sundance Institute, and when I went there, and it was like, oh, it'll be a few weeks out in New York in the summer, it'll be nice. And I saw music and film work together for the first time. I thought, oh my God. And I also thought that there was room for me there. You know what I mean? That I could like play with technology, I could work with people like Richard and Laura, that there was a future in it, whereas it felt like in the music scene in New York, and I was playing jazz at the time too, there certainly was no future there, but that's a joke. But, you know, so I really came out here, I came back, moved back to LA and started to, you know, pound the pavement and try to see if this was something that would work for me. And I think for me, there's something really wonderful in the daily practice of being a film composer. You know, it's like I mentioned that there are themes that you write that you throw out because, you know, they don't work for the film, and I like that. You know, I like that it's not like over pressurized, that you'll try something, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, and that's okay. Everybody, you know, recovers somehow and moves on. And I think like what you were talking about with earlier career composers, I think that maybe that's harder for younger composers to realize that it's just part of the process, that not everything is gonna be perfect for everybody, and you have to be able to let go of stuff and try again. And we were talking earlier at dinner, I think that, you know, part of this whole process of filmmaking is taking notes, right? So in other words, you know, people will give, let's say, suggestions to their collaborators, and sometimes they're mandates. And you've got to figure out a way to take those suggestions and actually use them to make the product better, rather than say, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing, or what does she know, I'm the composer. You know, if something's not working for somebody, there's a reason why, and it's your job to figure out why, and then to use that note to make it better.
It's often the case too, where it's very difficult for people to talk about sound and talk about music, they don't really have the language for it. So I always think my own job is being a translator,
Right.
from what they're trying to tell me to what they want to hear.
What's the hardest note you've ever gotten?
I mean, hardest to.
Like,
The
what's a
hardest
recent
notes-
note
I'll
that's
tell you,
been
the
hard?
hardest notes are the ones that are, the notes that work for me are when someone says, I wanna feel this.
Right.
If somebody says, it's not bassy enough,
Right.
That's not, I don't know what to do with that. Cause that doesn't mean anything to me, I mean, I know what they think it means, but like, why is it, what are you looking for that needs more faith? So I was like, the directors I like to work with the most are people who are actors, actually, because their whole currency is emotion, and they just talk to you in that language, and they can give you direction like they would give, like an actor would get from a director, so that's very helpful. Do you get direction like that?
That's exactly right. I mean, this is the point, is that when everybody says, the low violins, which can mean anything. And or nothing, and it's like you say, oh, that's cello, but no, it can be like a French horn, you know. When anybody uses a musical term, you're in big trouble. And so it's always better to talk about, you know, what Laura was saying, is what is the emotion that is missing? What needs to happen? If it's bassier, I mean, does that mean that it's not, scary, you know, in that moment, or not profound, or, you know, whatever adjective that we can come up with. I don't know. How did that do?
Yeah.
Was that it? Okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's that kind of stuff that I think we all find the most helpful, and for any young filmmakers, or even not young filmmakers. I think you talk to everybody, the crew, from beginning to end the same way. It's always gotta be about like what your role is in developing the character of the film at that moment. Whether it's gonna rely on sound effects or whether it's gonna rely on music, you've gotta figure out what the emotion is and what is the tool in your cinematic toolbox to actually execute that emotion. Right, Richard?
I agree.
See, he did Apocalypse Now. That's a good movie. Yeah, a lot. Yeah, I like that. And many other things.
Yeah, I think it's also, like, I've had directors, you know, sort of explain to me, like, well, we're in these close-ups because, you're like, oh, duh. You know, you watch the movie, but when someone tells you why they've made those choices, then suddenly you understand what the intention of those choices are. So very often, directors won't tell you that. You're kind of like, I think I know what you're trying to do, I hope I do, you know, you're kind of guessing your way around it, so.
I think I find it really helpful to just ask a lot of questions.
Mhm.
And even if you think you know the answer, a lot of times you don't. You know, but hey, we're lucky. This is just my retrospect.
All right, well, I think, that kind of wraps it up for us today, so thank you guys for coming.